welcome to Take Time. I'm your host, Patrick Marlatt, and let's talk about the C Ward 595. This is part 2, our in-depth review of the Christopher Ward 595. And if you don't know how these two-part reviews work, essentially in part 1, we do an unboxing and first impression. If you haven't watched that yet, I'll encourage you to do so now. That gives you a good sense of what the consumer packaging looks like, aside from the intro here. And in our part 2 review, I take all of your questions, comments, and concerns that are entered in on that part 1 video and answer them here in our part 2 review. Now, the main question that came up, the number one question in my opinion, the one I'm hoping to have a conversation about today is, do you need a dress watch? Now, I'm going to try to answer that question here on the show today, of course, with your help in the comment section down below. But as with all my reviews here on the channel, I like to start with the bad and then move on to the good before giving you my final opinion of the watch. Now, before we move on to the discussion of our Christopher Ward here, I want to talk briefly about the movement that is inside this watch. The ETA 7001, or as it was formerly known, the Puseux or Peso 7001. I've heard several pronunciations of the word. I might even start a poll in the top right of your screen if you want to tell me what the proper pronunciation is. I know you all love doing that. And if neither of those two is accurate, I'll leave a third suggestion for that. But the movement inside of this watch was adopted by ETA around the mid-80s, and it's been featured in a lot of watches since and even before. Everything from Stoa to Tissot to Baume and Mercier, even earlier Nomos watches have utilized this movement. It's actually quite a popular movement. And now we have it featured in a modern watch that utilizes its natural thinness to produce a watch that's also remarkably thin. You see, the ETA 7001 is about 2.5 millimeters thick. It's actually a really thin movement with a total diameter of 23.3 millimeters. Now, one of the reoccurring comments I received was, why doesn't it feature a sub-seconds dial? Now, it's not to say that this movement couldn't. As a matter of fact, a lot of 7001 case models feature a sub-seconds dial at 6 o'clock. That's how the movement was designed. It would feature a beat rate of 21,600 beats per hour, so it wouldn't be that smooth, but as it would have been a sub-second register, the hand itself would have been perceptibly smooth based on its relative size to the dial. Now, some of you guys brought up that it's just odd having a mechanical watch that's a two-hander. You know, you want to see the second sweep. I mean, that's part of the allure of having a mechanical watch. I get it. But we do need to bear in mind that this watch is 39 millimeters in diameter. And as I stated, the 7001 is under 24 millimeters. As it was designed to have that sub-second dial at the 6 o'clock position, it would rest kind of high up at the 6 o'clock register, nearing what would look like the center of the dial. I think the omission of a sub-seconds here makes perfect sense. I don't think the inclusion of it would have looked good aesthetically, so I do prefer the fact that it is lacking that feature, although I do want to mention that as a bad note. As we know a little bit more about the movement, I think it's forgivable, but it would have been nice for a lot of folks. Now, one of the first bad notes I'd like to mention about this watch, and it's going to bother some, less others, is the fact that the 7001 movement doesn't feature a hacking mechanism. It wasn't designed to do so. There may be variants that do offer it, but the 595 here does not offer hacking. So if that is an absolute essential for you, then do note that it is lacking from this watch. But you'll also notice that there are no minute markings between the hours. So hacking kind of feels irrelevant here because you don't have a seconds hand to measure out the minutes precisely, and you don't have minute markers to help gauge what time it is precisely. So it's sort of a bad note all around. I do wish they provided a version of this watch that featured minute markings. I feel like that was a miss, although I don't think that was the idea behind this design at its core. I think it was supposed to be minimalistic and utilitarian and only offer you an approximate time. I'll touch more on that a little bit later, but I would have preferred that there is a version with minute markers clearly defined on the dial. It would have been nice. Now, the next bad note I want to mention about this watch is smack dab on the dial at 9 o'clock. This is something you hear referenced to in almost all modern Christopher Ward video reviews, is the fact that folks don't like the new branding and or its location on the dial. Now, there is a lot to unpack here, but I'm going to start by referencing a few comments that were mentioned in our part 1 video A lot of folks were suggesting that they use their flag logo that's featured on the crown, actually. This marker over at the 12 o'clock instead, to keep the dial even more minimalist, removing the Christopher Ward text that is left aligned and on the 9 o'clock position, and just having the flag featured at 12. They think that would have provided a cleaner aesthetic. And while I agree, I don't think it would look as good. And this design was by choice. It was clearly deliberate from Christopher Ward. They're offering something different to the market, and I'll touch on this later too. But briefly, they're one of the only, if not the only, mid-tier luxury brand that does direct-to-consumer sales. There's no brick-and-mortar store. There's nothing like that. So they're already coming at the market with a different approach. So I can see why they made this choice. They're the brand that does something different. And I'll agree with you that maybe it could have been executed better, but my thoughts are a little different. So for me, it's not so much the placement of the Christopher Ward text on the dial. As a matter of fact, I do quite like the styling of it. I do like how it's left aligned. And I do like that they're using their name as opposed to the flag, the C Ward flag. What I dislike, and I mentioned this in an Instagram post, is the font choice. It's bland, wavering on sterile. It is a very, very simple piece of text, and it's not very exciting. I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't get me excited about the brand. I think their old logo had that characteristic. It was more stylish and more appealing to look at on the dial, and there's not much else to see here. The new Christopher Ward text font is almost IKEA-like in that it's just very, very, very simplistic. However, I will state that the font choice for the Christopher Ward text matches the style of the 595. I think it looks good overall with this watch. I don't think it looks good across their entire range. I'll agree with you guys there. I'm having more issues with this font choice than I am with our previous review item, which was the WatchGecko C1 chronograph. I like their font choice and styling there. I'm not such a fan overall of it on Christopher Ward's line. Again, though, I do think it looks good with the minimalistic styling of this watch. I don't think it looks good across the range. It's very much like the IKEA font, you know what I mean? Not that that's a bad thing necessarily. It just doesn't spring up in your mind thoughts of luxury. It's more consumer friendly. But I will say that is more in line with their brand's ideology, providing watches that are of quality at an affordable rate. So it's a good and a bad note. Now, the next bad note I have is actually a two-parter, and it's about the dimensions of this watch. First off, can a watch be too thin? I want to touch on that first. It's a minor note. I think this works overall. The one that really does bother me, though, is the 39 millimeter diameter. Now, the first part of this bad note is actually a minor one for me, but if you are the type of individual that associates quality with the feel, that is the heft of a watch on your wrist, or its presence on your wrist, this might not be the watch for you. Because of its relative thinness and its lack of weight due to its scale, it almost disappears on your wrist. And that kind of quality isn't for everyone, and I understand that. So I will say that is a bad note. For me, it's actually a positive one. I like the fact that I can forget about it on my wrist, but it is there, in fact, if I need to check the time. But for those of you that wanted a heftier watch or something that is more apparent on your wrist, maybe getting the bracelet option would help with that. But on the leather strap, it kind of vanishes, and I can see that being an issue for some. And the second half of that bad note is, again, the 39 millimeter diameter. I think what they were trying to accomplish here was the perfect blend of modern dress watch with the classic scale of a vintage dress piece. I think of vintage dress watches predominantly as being something that is between, but mainly 36 millimeters in diameter to 38. That's sort of my conceptualization of a dress watch, whereas a modern dress watch, like some of the Seikos we featured on this show, are 40 millimeters and up. Now, this does strike the perfect balance between a vintage and modern dress watch at 39 millimeters. However, due to its thinness at 5.95 millimeters thin, relative to the diameter of the watch, it feels like you have a discus sitting on your wrist. It almost looks like a dinner plate is atop your wrist, like a ceramic dinner plate, because of especially this opaline white dial. And you'll see what I'm talking about during our wrist shot. I'll point it out then too. But the bezel is so thin on this guy, and the dial expands much farther out than the width of the movement than is absolutely necessary. I wish they had brought it down to 38 or maybe even a little bit smaller in diameter. I think it would have done a lot of justice to this watch, although you wouldn't have been able to make out some of the really, really refined case details. So there are positive notes in its scale that I'll touch on when we move on to our good notes as well. Now, before we move on to our good notes concerning the 595, I want to touch on briefly an item that folks were suggesting as an alternative to the C Ward we have in today, and that is the Hamilton Intramatic. So folks over on Instagram, and if you haven't visited my Instagram yet, you can Take Time Pat. I like to have conversations over there when I'm not on YouTube. But also here on YouTube, folks have suggested this watch, so I gave it a look. They're about the same price. They're both Swiss made. They both feature ETA movements. In the Hamilton, we have a 2892, so it's a little bit thicker. The Intramatic, it weighs in about 10 millimeters thick, I believe. Again, same cost at about $500. However, it's a two-hander with a date at the 6 o'clock. So if you didn't want the date, they don't offer you a variant without the date. And secondly, it doesn't accomplish being a thinner dress watch at that price range. And this is one of the things I want to address as we discuss whether or not you need a dress watch. And I think that the C Ward we have here is more in line with my thoughts on what a dress watch should be. So I would still recommend the C Ward at this point, but I haven't had an Intramatic in yet. So if that's something you want to see reviewed, let me know. I'm surprised it came up more than once, honestly, so I thought I should mention it. Now, before we move on to those good notes, I want to show you guys what this watch looks like on the wrist. So here is what the C Ward 595 is going to look like for all of your admirers, and here is what the watch is going to look like when you go to admire it. And here is the 595 on a 7¼ inch wrist, and you can sort of immediately see what I was saying in the latter half of my bad notes there, that the dial, because of its minimalistic design, and the bezel for its relative thinness, make the watch appear to have more presence than it actually does have. Now, I hope when they move to the Mark II variant of this watch, they'll cut the scale down to 38 instead. I think it will wear that much better. But on a 7¼ inch wrist, and I'll even venture to say, if you had a 6½ inch wrist, with the lug-to-lug dimensions being 46 millimeters, I think you'll be able to get away with this just fine. But do note, it will look like a wall clock on your wrist if it's much smaller because of the presence it has. And while we're down here, why don't we look at the thinness of this watch, and you can see just how thin it is when paired against my wrist. And I absolutely love how it pulls that vanishing act I mentioned before. I like the fact that you can lose it on the wrist and that it's there when you need it for an approximate time. I like that quality quite a lot. And this is going to lead into our conversation on whether we need dress watches or not, is that thin scale. I think this is the determining factor for most dress watches moving forward to, separate themselves from the rest of the market as a timepiece that needs to be in your collection. So, do you need a dress watch? Now, this is a conversation topic that somewhat deserves its own video. However, I will try to tackle it here as it has been mentioned in our part 1, and it's a discussion I've had off the channel multiple times. And someone actually remarked, ever since Bond stepped onto the scene with a Seamaster in a tuxedo, and before that with a Rolex, it just changed the dynamic of what is socially appropriate. I think over the last few years, the line that has divided dress watches from everything else, sports watches, casual watches, whatever, has become extremely blurred. And it's only becoming blurrier as nowadays companies are creating modern dress watches that have the proportions and dimensions of those watches. They are larger in scale, they are larger in diameter, they have more heft on the wrist, they have more presence, when traditionally, in my opinion, a dress watch should be smaller, should be thinner, and should vanish when you don't need it. Now, to touch back on the Hamilton Intramatic I mentioned earlier, I think the 10mm thinness is great. I believe most modern gents will find that perfectly suitable. However, this is one better. If the watch industry wants to continue marketing dress watches, it needs to clearly define what that is. And Christopher Ward did more than just make a watch here. They made a statement. It should be thin, mechanical, and elegant. And the 595 is all of those things. Now, one of the first good notes I want to mention about the 595 is actually the case design itself. It is indeed elegant and very well executed. It is one of the better machined watches I've ever received. The lines are sharp and the polish is exquisite. But what I like most about this watch is that you're starting to see a language develop within the brand, a design language, that is. This is, in my opinion, one of their flagship dress watches. It is something that is going to lead the way into their future designs, and it shares a lot of hallmarks that are part of the Christopher Ward DNA with those lugs. It shares an extremely similar lug design to the Trident series, and I love that they have a through line in their collection now, because without ever looking at the dial, I can see the case and tell that this is a Christopher Ward. It's akin to seeing something like a Rolex Oyster case. We can almost always immediately identify one and associate it with that brand. And it's really great that they made a design, in my opinion, that is extremely original to their own line of watches and immediately identifiable. That's extremely appealing. But, beyond this case design, they have other unique offerings in their range. So I like that they have something that I consider to be a flagship design for them. Another good note I'd like to mention is the fact that this watch has omitted the seconds hand. I really like the two-handed design, and this is actually the first two-hander I've ever owned. And I can almost forgive the lack of a minute track because two-handers are ever only going to tell you in an approximate time. And what that does is it eases the anxiety we have that we're slaves to time, that, we need to be at a certain place at a certain time, things need to be arranged within intervals of time, and this watch sort of frees you. It gives you a little sense of relief from that. I will say, however, I've turned to this more casually than as a dress piece or something I needed on the job because of that nature. But it's really refreshing to own a two-hander, and I think the overall execution with the omission of the seconds hand has made this a really great watch. Now, as I mentioned, it is the only two-hander in my collection, but if you've never owned one, it's actually really nice not to have a seconds hand on the dial. Because this lacks hacking, that's also one less thing you need to be concerned about. There's a lot of freedom when you have a two-hander, and it's nice to only casually glance at the time as opposed to be worried about precision. Now, to touch back on the case design of this watch, I really do love it overall. I like the flat sapphire crystal. Aside from the diameter of this watch, if it was one smaller, it may just be perfect, but as it stands, the curvature of the sides of the case and how they swoop towards the lugs, it just lends to what I'd consider pretty perfect wearability, and the relative thinness and weight of this watch makes it extremely pleasant on the wrist. There's no discomfort, and it's, again, barely perceptible. So if that's what you're down for, you get that here. It's a really great offering for that. And by the way, the crown and crown action is phenomenal. The tubing that holds the crown and stem assembly in is really thick. It's actually really pleasant, the action on the crown itself. Now, while the action is great at adjusting the time of the watch, I will say that the hand winding mechanism does take a little while to get used to. If you've never used a 7001, it puts up a little resistance as you turn it to give you an idea of when you should stop winding it, but it is an odd feeling in the hand. Again, it's just something you need to get used to. I would recommend doing 18 to 20 full turns and stopping at that. You might not be able to tell if that's enough at first, but I've found that this has been able to last through an entire day and into the next morning by doing so. And you never really want to fully wind out a hand-wound watch. Anyways, it's not the best thing to do to the watch movement. So I'd suggest 18 to 20 turns and you're likely good. Now, while we're down here, I want to take in that leather strap because you know what? At $500, this was one of the better offerings I've received. I quite enjoyed this strap. And if you remember from my part 1 video, I mentioned taking it off this and trying it out on a Perlon or something else. Well, this has lived on this leather strap the whole time because it was just extremely supple and extremely enjoyable experience. And the perfect pairing, honestly, for this watch head. You know, they did a really great job when pairing not only the color of the strap to the watch, it's got black accents on the side, sort of to reflect the gloss black hands on the dial. It's just a really good look overall. But beyond the aesthetic of the strap, just the build quality and overall wearability is there. Again, this is one of the better leather straps I've received at that price point. And you got that custom buckle as well. There's nothing not to like about the strap. Now, as you guys know from our part 1 video, I actually purchased this watch for the review and I joked about returning it in case I didn't like it to test their return policy. I've heard really good things about it. And after having owned it and worn it for as long as I have, it's become a part of my collection in a way I didn't expect it would. It's something I didn't have, the two-hander, the minimalistic style, and honestly, the wearability day-to-day as a casual timepiece, less so a dress watch, it was just extremely enjoyable. There haven't been many dress occasions where I needed to pull this out, but I feel like it would perform a good role at that as well. And with that 5-year warranty, it's kind of hard not to keep. And of course, if I ever have to use it, I'll let you guys know how that experience is here on the show. But I have to say, they've set an industry standard with that, and they've fully backed and supported their watches with their name. And that's really telling of a brand. They obviously believe in what they're making, and with good reason. I think overall the finish and execution of this watch is impeccable. I think it is a great first attempt at what a dress watch should be in the 21st century. I think that this is one of their flagship models and one I want to keep. I can see if they discontinue this being an important model in their range, because I want to see more 6mm or even thinner dress watches from them. It's going to be great when those pour onto the market. Different styles, some with subdials, some with minute tracks, different scales. I think they've got the right idea and they're heading in the right direction. This is the first of those pieces, and it's a cool one to own. I think that the 595 is an excellent addition to their dress watch lineup and the definitive dress watch from their collection. Not that many competitors offer a watch at this price with a great mechanical movement and all the material components. The sapphire crystal, the stainless steel, it's all really good. And with a design that is perfectly Christopher Ward, I don't think you can go wrong with this one. Unless you don't like two-handers and have to see a seconds hand sweeping, I don't think you can go wrong with this one. Oh, also, if you don't like the Christopher Ward text, and I totally get where you guys are coming from, you're gonna hate it. But everyone else, if you're looking for a thin dress watch, they made a good one here. At any rate, gang, if you found this video informative or in the least entertaining, feel free to hit that like button. It looks a little something like this. If you have friends, forums, or groups that were looking for an in-depth review on this timepiece, feel free to send this to them. I know that Christopher Ward is new to me as well. Like, this is my first Christopher Ward, and you feel a little shaky buying into it because it is direct to consumer. Like, that is how their marketplace works. So you're not going to be able to take it in beforehand. But as far as a first impression is concerned, I'm really impressed with what I'm seeing. I think it's worth the look. And what's great, again, is if you don't like it, you can return it automatically. At least that's what I've been told. So I didn't get to test that here because I liked it that much. So that's a good thing. Also, if you are new to the channel and like the take time format of two-part reviews and sharing a conversation with each other and myself, well, then I would suggest subscribing because we do reviews like this pretty much weekly now. I'm very happy to have a lot of watches shipped in, and I cannot wait to continue with more two-part reviews, having more discussions with you guys. It's really great fun for me. So if you want to join in on those on a weekly basis, feel free to subscribe. Again, my name is Patrick Marlett, and thank you for the time.